Okay, so welcome to the Vernon Area Public Libraries program about racial justice and Civil War monuments. We are very pleased to have with us today Ashleigh Lawrence-Sanders. I first saw Ashleigh participate in a panel discussion over the summer about Civil War monuments and statues, and she just really stood out to me on this panel. And so I reached out to her and invited her to speak to our audience about this topic. It's such an interesting topic, and I thought we all could really use some clarity around it. So I was really excited when she accepted. Ashleigh is an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Dayton. She holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University, where she concentrated in African American and United States history. She teaches courses in U.S. history, historical memory, African American history, and African American women's history. So Ashleigh, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Roz, for having me. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm actually very excited to talk more and more about this topic because, it continues to be extremely relevant for everything that's going on in our country right now. So thank you all for being here. I'm just going to start sort of just briefly laying out what I'm going to go over in my talk tonight, because I think I'm going to take you a bit on a trip throughout history. I'm a historian after all, so I like to start in the present, and I like to go back, and then I like to bring us back to the present again. And I think that's what we're going to do. So I have some slides. They're mostly images, so, you don't have to feel free like you're going to be missing much, but I did want, sort of these images to be an important part of how we have this conversation. So in 2020, monuments are coming down rapidly. It's been a huge display of power, the power of protest, but Confederate and other monuments being removed are part of a much longer history of what I call African American counter memory of the Civil War. So since the end of the American Civil War, Black Americans have contested what they think are the dominant narratives of the war and the dominant narratives of Civil War memory. They've challenged the lost cause, which we'll talk a little bit later in this. I'll talk a little bit later about what that is. And they have asserted their own narratives of the war that center African American emancipation and liberation as sort of the central reasons and outcomes of the war. So Black Civil War memory, I argue, is actually foundational for understanding Black activism in the United States over the last 150 years. So what we've seen is that whenever Black movements and protest movements have intensified in the last 150 years, we've seen an increase in Black public engagement with the memory of the Civil War and a clash of tensions over the memory of the Civil War. So with protest comes a clash of historical memory. So in this particular summer of unrest and civil unrest and Black Lives Matter protests, it's pretty much the end of a historical trajectory and the natural end of historical trajectory that we would end up here, right? So this is one of many images I'm going to show throughout this presentation of this particular monument, because this is sort of the monument, the Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia, that I believe really encapsulates a lot of, the tensions, the extra legal, as I call it, extra legal contextualization. As you see here, there's all sorts of graffiti, some expletive on the monument. But what's noticeable, of course, is this projection of the face of George Floyd and the words Black Lives Matter. And BLM, of course, is projected over Lee, who is sitting on top of his horse, as many of these statues are. So, this is familiar to all of you guys, but of course, the protest started at the end of May in this year after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by police officers. Protests began in Minneapolis. They spread to nearly every state, every major city, small and mid-sized cities, and lots of suburbs, right? So this is probably, I think, easily the longest and largest mass protest in this country since the 1960s. So, but it feels like we're living in a really uniquely kind of exciting but tense time. It's true, we are. And we're living in a very uniquely intense time. The protests have continued, and I think that, it's not, you don't see it as much in the news as you did in June in particular, but what we've seen is with every, successive police shooting, we've seen continued number of people on the streets. But as sure as the question that brought many of you here today is, what do Black Lives Matter protests and protests for racial justice have to do with monuments? So how do we get here? And by here, I mean these moments right here. So on the left is an image of a monument that was taken down by protesters in North Carolina over the summer. And over here is the John C. Calhoun Monument in Charleston, which is where I'm from originally, in South Carolina. And this monument was removed by the city. So you see Calhoun finally coming off the top of his perch. It actually took them, they removed Calhoun, but they finally actually did away with the rest of the monument just a couple of weeks ago. They had to use explosives. It's, it was ingrained there. There's all sorts of, things you can say about a monument like Calhoun being so ingrained in the foundation of the earth that it took explosives to get it out. But, that's literally what happened. So as part of the protests, Confederate monuments and other monuments were targeted for vandalism, defacement, and sometimes, yes, removal by protesters who have literally removed the monuments themselves and taken them down. Not all of the protests have directly attacked monuments physically. Some have just called for their removal. But what I want to do is to go back in history to really help understand why these monuments were erected in the first place and why they likely over time have become targets over and over again in protest, or just been defaced as sort of opposition or protest over time. So to understand that, we really need to go back to the Civil War. So the lost cause is probably a familiar term to many of you, but I thought I would sort of go over it a bit. How did we get here? The lost cause is sort of how we got here. The lost cause is why there are so many Confederate monuments, literally hundreds and hundreds, littered throughout the entire United States, not just the South. So Confederate monuments are sort of an output, like the physical manifestation of the lost cause. And here are sort of like a few elements of the lost cause here that I think really define what it was and how you can understand it. One is like sort of this renaming of the Civil War. The War of Northern Aggression was a favorite sort of renaming of the Civil War. So was the war between the states, anything but Civil War. So even the terminology war between the states, which I'm sure many of you have heard, maybe some of you have used, unintentionally, is actually language that emerged out of the Lost Cause movement. And the Lost Cause emerges pretty much right after the Civil War itself, but the height of it is actually the late 19th and early 20th century. They tend to focus around these mythological elements of slavery not being the cause of the war. So, when there have been polls over the years about the cause of the Civil War, was some people, just say it was states' rights. And of course, my response as a historian is like, the states' right to do what? What was South Carolina trying to do? What was the right that they were trying to secure, right? It was the right to continue to own slaves, to have slave owning as legally a part of their state law, and to expand slavery. But in the Lost Cause, slavery was not the cause of the war. Also, slavery was benign. That's also one of the fundamental elements of Lost Cause mythology. Also, and these two elements really relate to why there's so many monuments, is that there was this idea that it was a noble and chivalrous South, and that's the type of South it was in the antebellum era, pre-Civil War. Also, this idea of glorification of leaders, soldiers of the Confederacy, defense of a white Southern way of life. So glorification of leaders and soldiers, we see people like Lee become literally a Christ-like figure within Lost Cause mythology. And Lost Cause mythology picks up in the 1870s, where you see a lot of white Southerners, particularly some veterans, really start to write a lot of histories and literature around the war. And they're starting to try to make sense of defeat, but also beyond sort of the nostalgia of it, they're making sense with Reconstruction, because Reconstruction is an era in which Black people have gained rights and Black people are invading public space. So they're making sense of this nostalgia of an old South, because an old South before they lost the Civil War means a racial hierarchy, which is very familiar to them. So the Lost Cause is not just about nostalgia. It's about power. It's about white supremacy, and it's about the reinstitution of a racial hierarchy that happens at the end of Reconstruction. And because it happens at the end of Reconstruction, we see the lost causes height of power once Reconstruction is over, once there's no more federal troops in the South. We see in the 1880s and 1890s, Black rights in the South start to roll back. The lost cause becomes more powerful. 1880s and 1890s is when we have the founding of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy helped basically erect many of these monuments. So this is just a graphic I took from the Southern Poverty Law Center as of 2016. I don't think much has changed since 2016, though there were a couple of Confederate monuments that went up in the last couple of years. So the one absolutely noticeable thing about this, right, is that most of the monuments went up between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. That is the period that we call the height of the lost cause. This is the period where most monuments, Confederate monuments, went up. You notice in this chart, they spread it up between monuments, monuments on courthouse grounds, and also schools. So Confederate iconography is sort of a broad phrasing, which also means the naming of things. So one thing you'll notice when you get to the civil rights movement is that you'll see a lot more schools are being named after Confederate heroes once we get to the point of segregation and desegregation battles. It's not a coincidence that this is happening at the same time. It's also not a coincidence that the height of the lost cause happens as sort of the height of Jim Crow and what, you know, many African-American historians call the nadir of Black rights, which is, you know, a time when Black people are steadily losing rights. They lost the right to vote that they had gained during Reconstruction. It's a lot more violent in the South. There's more lynching. Public space and public commemoration for African Americans is not happening in the same way during the same time period. And meanwhile, the lost cause is basically taking up all of the physical space and what I call the commemorative landscape, the physical commemorative landscape. So the most powerful of these lost cause groups is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC. They were formed in 1894, and they continue even to this day to be one of the primary protectors of so-called Confederate heritage. You know, like the name suggests, they're the daughters of Confederate veterans. They consider themselves the protectors of true history of the war. And much of the focus on the UDC has been on monuments. And I have to say, yes, they are an organization more than any other which funded and financed the most Confederate monuments in the United States. Here's an image here from the dedication of the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. As you can see, these are UDC members. They're putting up, you know, a flag, a Confederate flag in the foreground of this dedication. But I think, like, to understand the true power of the UDC, you understand that their mission was to basically embed in the physical landscape the heritage, the Confederate heritage and Confederate nostalgia that's embedded within the lost cause and all the white supremacy that's embedded in that. But also, even more so, and I think a lot of historians of the organization would agree, their long-lasting goal was to have an effect on how history was taught and told itself. So I always show this to, you know, talks and people because I think you have to really see it to believe it, what type of history was being written, and also to understand the effect of this history on how history is still taught today. So Mildred Lewis Rutherford was the official historian of the UDC for many years. She wrote, I think, well over a dozen books, if not more. And her focus was to basically disseminate this type of learning to the public. And this is one of her books. It was published in 1920 called The Truths of History. I always like to highlight certain interesting parts. Like right here, she says, this is a fair, unbiased, impartial, unprejudiced, and conscientious study of history. And it's like, you know, by all those adjectives, you're probably in the mood for something that's not all of those things. I mean, you would just assume that, you know, if you were just writing a history, you wouldn't have to say all of those things, that you're in for a ride, right? And you are. You know, I just highlighted a couple of the section titles here because these are the types of histories. This is how the history of the Civil War was taught, not just in the South, but many parts of the rest of the country for a long time. So here is secession was not rebellion. This is a subset, subsection in this book. Another one was that the war between the states was not fought over the slaves. And this goes back to what I said was one of the foundational elements of the lost cause, was that the war was not about slavery. The other is that the slaves were not ill-treated in the South, and the North was largely responsible for their presence in the South. So not only were slaves not treated badly, I mean, even the war is not about slavery, that's first. Then slaves were not treated badly. And also, it's the North's fault that they were in the South in the first place. So this is the type of history that the UDC was putting out. The UDC focused very heavily on pushing, school age versions of these histories to schools, to K through 12 schools, the primary schools, to children. They had a whole arm of their organization which focused on primary and secondary education, because they assumed that this was a corrective form of history, that the North was going to come and distort the history of the war. And the influence of this has kind of been devastating. I said this goes beyond the South, and it's true, because even the fact that we still have people debating whether or not slavery was the cause of the war, and there are like a huge percentage of people in this country who would say slavery was not the cause of the war, is a success of the lost cause movement. So monuments were sort of the concrete representations of this distortion. They were the concrete representations of white supremacist thought and ideas. They were essential in that way because they were the physical, material outputs of this type of history. But the histories like this are examples of the type of mythologies that underline the monuments, and actually have had a much broader effect on the way that we understand the history of the Civil War and the ways we understand the histories of slavery. Just a quick note that this, went, of course, beyond the South. In my own research, when I studied Black Civil War memory, I came across a report that the NAACP wrote in the 1940s, where they were critiquing the textbooks, the history textbooks in New York City, because their version of the Civil War had some of these same elements in it. This idea of paternalistic slavery, this idea that the war may not have only been about slavery. Like, this was in New York City textbooks in the 1940s. So it's been a great amount of undoing to do this kind of work of the UDC. It's as rooted in the ground as the monuments are, I have to say. So what were African Americans' response to the lost cause and to these monuments going up? And here in the Black response, we really find the historical roots of this moment right now. So Black people responded in various ways to the erections of the monuments. As I hinted in my earlier part of my discussion, protests today are sort of the legacy of this, right? So when we see people really confronting monuments as being symbolically important for the issue of racial justice and racial injustice, this is where sort of I say their activist ancestors come from. So we have people like John Mitchell Jr. He's an editor. He is eventually like an alderman in Richmond. He's many things. He's a business owner. And in the Richmond Planet, he actually has several screeds against monuments. The Lee Monument in particular, the monument that I showed at the very beginning that's now been graffitied and contextualized constantly. The Lee Monument was unveiled in 1890, and it was the first monument on what became Monument Avenue in Richmond. So John Mitchell fought this monument throughout his whole editorial page, throughout this whole year, and then he never really ended. You can see here's a little snippet from the article, one of many articles he wrote. At the end, he says, "Rebel flags were everywhere displayed, and long lines of Confederate veterans who embraced the opportunity and attended the reunion to join again in the rebel yell, told in no uncertain tones that they were still clung to theories which were presumed to be buried for all eternity." So this is kind of a warning from Mitchell, and that this is beyond the monument, right? It's more than just a physical monument. It's what it stands for. And to Mitchell in 1890, it stands for, a return to the past. These theories, these ideas, these ideologies, these are Confederate ideas and ideologies about Black people. and that the monuments represent them, but even beyond that, they become sort of the physical manifestations of these ideologies, which are dangerous to African Americans. You know, John Mitchell Jr., you know, he wrote several articles about this monument. And in another article, he actually says that, you know, he saw rebel flags everywhere, but he saw no United States flag. So he was actually questioning the patriotism of, you know, Confederate veterans and lost causers who were so in praise of Lee that they would not even fly an American flag. So hitting at the patriotism of lost causers was an actual, you know, consistent strategy that African Americans carried out. The other thing that happened, which should sound very familiar to today, is defacing and vandalizing. Yes, vandalism was common and frequent. These are just 3 different articles. They take place all in the late 19th to early 20th century, so during that height of Confederate monument erection. And these are sort of articles about people defacing monuments. Now, what we don't know the race of the perpetrators, because for most of these vandalism, from what I can tell, they don't catch the person except for one case. From my own research, I think it is more than likely African Americans, because oral histories in some of these areas about monuments, actually Confederate monuments, prove that African Americans did actively deface these monuments. So, you know, we see here, this is in Chatham in North Carolina. The headline says, "Hanging Too Good for Miscreant Who Defaced Confederate Monument." You know, on that night, some person or persons defaced the monument recently erected. So this was a monument that I think at this point had only been up for a couple of weeks before someone defaced it. Defacement was made with black shoe polish and grease. After several hours of hard scrubbing, most of the shoe polish was removed, but still a few streaks remain on the monument. And, you know, there's one here from Monroe, North Carolina, and then there's one from Alexandria, Virginia. So like I said, I've come across dozens of these. Monuments were constantly vandalized, likely by African Americans. So while you had this sort of editorial response, you also had, you know, we're gonna go out and smash it up, dump it in paint, the same type of things we saw happen to monuments this summer. They also have a very long history and a long trajectory and tradition as well. In the early 1920s, the UDC was still putting up monuments, and they actually tried to put up, you know, a Mammy memorial, a memorial or a monument on the National Mall to honor Mammy, the stereotypical and mythical loyal Black woman household slave. This image was this is like a central figure for the UDC. When I say that, actually, there were women, white women who were part of the UDC, who actually had shows where they would portray a mammy in blackface and you know, and stereotypical dialect, where they would like perform this all over the country, because clinging on to, you know, a mythical and benign slave also was sort of a way of like embedding nostalgia and ignoring like what African Americans and African American life was like in freedom, right? So you can ignore the particular ways in which African Americans are asking for rights if you always are clinging back to this idea of a mammy figure being like the ideal Black person. So they wanted to erect a monument. They had senators and congressmen who supported them in getting this monument erected on the National Mall. You know, right there with all the other, like, you know, infamous monuments that are there now. So Black women's organizations like the National Association for Colored Women, which was a Black women's club, started by Mary Church Terrell, they pushed back strongly. They wrote editorials, they staged protest letters and cards. They wanted this monument to not be erected at all. So after some of the pushback made it into the Northern press in particular, you saw a lot of senators and congressmen sort of like call this into question. And here is this editorial from the Baltimore Afro-American, which is a Black newspaper. These editorial cartoons. You can see here, there's this image of Mammy is saying, "In grateful memory to one we never paid a cent or wages during a lifetime of service." Then over here is this other image. This was also from the Baltimore Afro-American. It says, use that monument fund to pass a law that will stop lynching of my children. And a lot of the pushback against the Mammy Memorial mentioned the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which was an anti-lynching bill that was brought up in the Senate. It would make lynching a federal crime. And African-American activists and organizations pushed very heavily for this bill. So did some Republicans and some Democrats from the North. But Southern Democrats did not want this bill to pass. They filibustered it. The bill never passed. Recently, I'm trying to think how long ago it was. A few months ago or whatever, like lynching was made like a federal crime. And then like I know a few years ago within the Senate, there was a kind of formal apology issued for the fact that this bill would never pass. But this is just to say that, this was a political issue at the time. The lynching, anti-lynching battles were political issues at the time. They leveraged those battles to basically make an argument against a monument, a Confederate monument, but also a monument that was really like a stereotypical monument that disparaged Black women and actually made light, as these editorials suggest, of the real issues that were facing Black people during that time period. So by the time that we get to the 60s and 70s, we pretty much got an entrenched, very much long, century-long battle over Civil War memory. And this is what happened time and time again. So, in the 50s, there were battles over the Confederate flag. I don't get into the flag that much in this talk, but just know that there are constant battles over the flag from the early 1900s to today, right? But for monuments in particular, monuments sort of became these locations where, they were targeted by Black protesters. So the memory of the Civil War was flourishing during the 1960s. It'd been 100 years since the end of the Civil War. The Civil War Centennial, which, was an organization that was put together by the federal government. It was mostly led by white Northern academics, who were Democrats, who were liberals. But the Centennial sort of failed in spectacular ways because it really refused to engage the true legacy of the war, which was Black liberation. And you have to consider the political time frame of this as well, because this is like, the Cold War is happening. And during the Cold War, the United States is desperate to show that they have made lots of progress on race relations, right? So these part of these ideological battles. So actually engaging with like a very active and very visible and vibrant civil rights movement as part of commemorating the Civil War would have seemed natural, but it was actually antithetical to what the Civil War Centennial was trying to do, which is prove that they'd come so far in 100 years. Meanwhile, you have the civil rights activists like Martin Luther King and John Lewis and all these people talking very specifically about how far the US had not come in 100 years. So you have Black protesters and Black activists leveraging Civil War memory, but you have like a national government that's running away from it. And like I said, in the end, that was sort of one of its big failures, which is not to leverage the fact that this was 100 years since emancipation, and that, there was still a lot to account for. So this is the backdrop of the civil rights movement in particular. If you look at any of the images from the civil rights movement, be it the Little Rock Nine, integrating, Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, or, James Meredith attempting to integrate University of Mississippi, what you see in the background is tons of Confederate flags. And activists noticed this as well. Confederate flags during the 1960s actually make their way on top of the state houses in Mississippi and Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama. So this is when the state house, Confederate flags, or the integration of Confederate flags into state flags happens. It is a direct response to the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, monuments are all also, part of this sort of movement as well. In the mid 1960s, Black activists, when they're marching through many of the towns in the South, the SNCC activists in particular, they talk about how there was a fear that they would vandalize the monuments. So in one city in particular, in Mississippi, the local sheriff actually brings men out of the jails most of them were Black men, to guard the Confederate monuments because they're so afraid the Confederate monuments will be defaced. Because as I said, there's a long history of Black vandalism of these monuments. Now, this image in particular is from Tuskegee, Alabama. There were student demonstrations from Tuskegee University. They were protesting the acquittal of a white man, Marvin Segrest, who had killed a young Black activist, Sammy Young. Sammy Young was with SNCC also. He was, I think, 22 years old. And he got into argument with Segrest because Segrest had worked or owned a gas station that had a whites only bathroom. And in the argument, he basically killed Sammy Young, and then he was acquitted by an all white male jury. So there were protests in downtown Tuskegee after, and after those protests, this is what happened to the monument. So the monument was, spray painted, it was defaced, and, there are many things written on it, but one of the phrases written on there was Black Power. So this is, we're starting to see this really, the 1960s battles over monuments. By the time we get to the 70s, there are more monuments that are defaced. There are Confederate flags that are ripped down from schools. We're seeing a more direct and frequent confrontation over these symbols during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Which goes to my earlier point, which is that civil unrest leads to confrontations on memory and historical memory and monuments in particular. So our immediate moment actually has a very recent history. So there is sort of a first phase of monument renewal, the first wave of recent monument renewal, I'll call it, from about 2015 to 2017. So in the 80s and 90s, what you mostly see are battles over the Confederate flag. In Georgia and South Carolina in particular, very, very, very tense battles over the flag. Monuments, for the most part, seem to have been, they were continually defaced, they were continually vandalized, but there weren't as many vibrant conversations about them coming down. In local Black communities, yes, but making them out of those communities, not necessarily. So what happened in 2015? Well, a couple of things. Most notably, in June 2015, an Emanuel AME church in Charleston, South Carolina, a known white supremacist walks in and shoots and kills 9 parishioners. And when his social media is uncovered, there are tons of Confederate flags everywhere. So then the calls for the Confederate flag to come down start, to renew and become louder and louder to the point that it cannot be ignored. And Bree Newsom climbs up the flagpole. I'm sure you guys have seen that image. In Columbia, and snatches down the flag. And about a month later, the state legislature votes to basically do away with the Confederate flag on top of the State House. Or not on top of the State House, on the State House grounds. It had been on top of the State House until the 1990s, and they moved it to another spot on the State House grounds. And after that, though, people didn't stop with the flag. People started to question monuments again. Not just why is there not, why is the Confederate flag up, but why are these Confederate monuments still up? They're on public property, many of them. Not all, but many of them are. That means that it's public money, public funding that everyone is supposed to be able to take advantage of. And the call from, Black activists and white activists too is, does this landscape represent our community in the most accurate way? But I also want to back up a bit from Emanuel AME, because I think the actual key thing to understanding the movement that, emerges really rapidly and quickly on the ground is best explained in the advent of Black Lives Matter. So the Black Lives Matter movement, at this point is still a very young movement, mostly emerged in 2013. And what we see in this movement is a young and interracial group of, activists who can organize very quickly on the ground. The first sort of sustained and broad, by broad, I mean geographically broad social movement in this country in many decades, and one that could organize protests very quickly. This movement joined together with longstanding anti-monument sentiment in many of these local communities, and there were protests against police brutality and racial violence in many of these areas already. So the monument protest could happen that quickly. In the Charleston area in particular, just 2 months before the Manuel Amy massacre, there was a fairly famous police shooting in North Charleston, which is not that far from Charleston, of Walter Scott, which was one of the cases that, you know, if you're familiar with that year, you know, he had been running from the cop and was shot in the back. And, you know, we never would have known it if a bystander hadn't videotaped it through a fence. And so there were protests, there was a protest base already activated around that issue. So when Emmanuel happened and people really started to question, do we want to live in a city that has these vestiges that are so closely aligned to someone who would commit such an act, right? So really, African-American activists have targeted the vestiges of the lost cause alongside much larger structural goals. And that's what you start to see happen in 2015. So the Robert E. Lee Monument in New Orleans comes down, and so do other monuments in New Orleans. Mitch Landrieu makes a big push. He has this great speech around what we want New Orleans to be right now. In Baltimore, the city council passes very quickly an ordinance to remove all the Confederate monuments there. So we see a good handful of monuments, not that many, removed in the 2015 to 2017 period. And we see more protests happen around several other monuments. So really what happens is we kind of see two things. One, you know, as I said, the anti-monument protests have coalesced and joined with Black Lives Matter protests, and they joined with longstanding anti-monument movements in local communities to make a very vibrant push. But we also see a backlash. And in Charlottesville, what we start to see is a backlash. We see the pro-monument or the counter-protesters have now coalesced completely around the alt-right or the white supremacist and white nationalist organizations that came to Charlottesville in August 2017. You know, the rally there that, you know, resulted in the death of, you know, a young activist, Heather Heyer, was a rally to protect the Lee Monument in Charlottesville. And the imagery and the meaning of that monument obviously was going beyond just nostalgia, right? And in many ways, you know, these white nationalist groups' presence in Charlottesville to protect these monuments actually possibly may confirm some people's ideas of what the monuments meant in the first place. If there are white supremacists and white nationalists defending the monument, then they understand the monument's meaning in a very specific way. And it probably is the same way that activists have understood the meaning. So both of these things are happening at the same time. After Charlottesville, we see a bit of a lull in monument removal. You know, we had like a handful, I think there were like 5 to 7 major ones between 2015 and 2017. What we've seen since has been unlike anything else, and it's been sustained. So what we see now is both rapid removal by municipalities and states to remove monuments. We see extralegal contextualization and removal, meaning people just contextualizing monuments on their own and removing them. And we also just see an increase in discussion around monuments and namings of things. So one of the things people often ask me is, why do protesters target the monuments while they're protesting? In many ways, as I said, it's part of an old tradition, interlinking a Civil War memory with protests against racial violence and racial injustice. This has happened literally since the monuments went up in the late 19th century. Also, just the idea that monuments themselves are not representative of many of the people who protest. They went up without the input or consent of local Black communities, and they've taken millions and millions of dollars to maintain. I think the Southern Poverty Law Center did a study. It was really over a couple $100 million over just a short number of years when you total up all the expenses of monuments in many of the cities in which they sit throughout the South. Some of these monuments themselves have become markers of violence and entryways for excluding Black Americans from certain parts of these towns. As protesters are out and they're protesting and they're angry and they're looking for a place to enact their physical rage, a monument is a place to do it. It's a landscape, right? It's a representative landscape of something that they're fighting against to them. It can be an easy target. They can be painted and defaced, vandalized, pulled down in some of these cases. So then the other question I often get is, why don't protesters try to wait for local governments to remove monuments or try to go through legal means? And I think that that's a complicated question because truthfully, the legal processes for taking down some of these monuments stalled post 2015. In particular in Charleston, there was it's a huge push to bring down Calhoun in 2015 after the Confederate flag came down. What happened was they created a commission, the commission met and they talked and they issued a report. In the end, their recommendation was to put a plaque there. So then the commission gave the language for the plaque, but nobody was happy with the language. So the language, first, a lot of people thought the language was too strong because it said, Calhoun basically by supporting slavery committed crimes against humanity. And, people didn't want to hear that. And even so, there were Black politicians on the city council who didn't want to vote for the plaque because they thought the statue should just come down. This was the process. This happened from 2015 to about 2018, and then it stalled, and then nothing happened. So many protesters felt that they were not linked to that process. They were not asked. The communities were not part of the processes on what should happen to these monuments. So municipalities' refusal to actually grapple with or make these final decisions actually left the decision up to protesters out on the street one day for some of these places. So now we're seeing many municipalities move a lot faster because they've been forced to move faster because they're afraid that monuments are going to be torn down or they don't want to be seen as not doing enough. These images, so this is another image of the Lee Monument. This is actually an image from Fort Mill, South Carolina, and it's one of the few faithful slave monuments in the United States. It's literally a monument to our loyal and faithful slaves in the middle of a cemetery. And activists in Fort Mill over the summer projected in white supremacy on that monument. It started a campaign, an actual campaign with the local government to try to get the monument removed. And last I heard, they had a hearing over the summer where people talked virtually about, and it was overwhelming. The people who talked were in support of removing the monument, but it seems like in the community wide, there's not a lot of support. So this is sort of the process. This is the legal process of trying to get monuments removed. In states like South Carolina, there's something called the Heritage Act, which was passed in the year 2000. And as part of that act, they moved the Confederate flag off top of the State House to the State House grounds. And they also created a Confederate Memorial Day. And all that was done, and the trade-off was that they finally made Martin Luther King Jr. Day a holiday. I'm not kidding. So that law actually prevents any monuments and memorials, war monuments, memorials from being removed without the consent of the state government. So there are state laws like that in several southern states, which actually may prevent a lot of local municipalities from removing these monuments themselves. So there are a lot of legal handcuffs on what can be done legally to remove monuments throughout the South. So naturally, or I think naturally, the conversation around monuments has moved beyond Confederate monuments. So here on the left, you see Christopher Columbus statue being torn down in Minnesota by indigenous activists. On the right is Frank Rizzo statues. Frank Rizzo was the mayor and police chief of Philadelphia, considered to be very racist, he was. And during the Black Lives Matter protests, his statue was defaced. We've seen the statue of conquistadors come down, even a statue of Jefferson come down. This infamous Teddy Roosevelt statue outside the Museum of Natural History, which is, fairly racist statue, not just because it's Teddy Roosevelt, but because it has, a bare-chested Native man and African man underneath Teddy Roosevelt on a horse. I don't know if you've ever been to Natural History Museum in New York, but it's outside there facing the park. That's been removed. In you guys' neck of the woods, near Chicago, there's lots of discussion around the Stephen Douglas statue and renaming Stephen Douglas Park actually after Frederick Douglass with 2 S's. So there hasn't really been a state or major city who hasn't been touched by this issue in some ways. It's moving beyond just discussing the presence of Confederate statues necessary. I think so. I think the issue of monument removal beyond just the easy traitor statues, because we can say with the Confederates, they were traitors. We shouldn't be acknowledging them, right? And that's why we've seen, the fact that there's been sort of broad support in some areas for those statues gone. But what happens when we move beyond Confederate statues? We've seen protests in literally every state in the nation. It's foundational and widespread. This is a point where activists are leveraging historical memory for themselves. And this may mean talking about the issues of racial justice beyond just the South, the non-South racism, right? If racism is foundational to a story or part of American narrative, would not the problems of the physical landscape also be part of this? That's just a question to think about. So just to end here, what comes next? I don't know. I don't know what comes next. This is the final image of the Lee Monument, and you see these young boys, these young Black boys playing basketball outside there. It's become kind of a recreational space. This is sort of the probing questions of what do we want our state and local landscapes to look like? No matter the origin of these monuments, the confrontations over them are indicative of the ways in which some people feel a disconnect with their state and local histories. Monuments are the most visible and obvious elements of local history. I'm wary of the deliberate processes that some of my historical colleagues are saying that we should undertake, to decide which monuments should stay and go, knowing that in a time of civil unrest and pandemic, the processes discussion would not happen in any sort of normal way. But I do think we're in a moment where we can rethink the physical landscapes that we're on, which there's been so much money and time and effort devoted to. For me as a historian, I think the preservation of history beyond just the physical space. Protests over racial justice are expanding these long-standing tensions over physical space, and the ways that statues, monuments, historical markers are representative of particular politics, of a particular time and place, of particular people, and not of others. And that is a fundamental problem within the arguments for racial justice in this country. So the opportunities here of addressing how our physical landscape matches the sort of politics and the sort of ideologies that we believe in, the sort of goals of racial justice. I think that, what's been forced into the forefront by these protests are these discussions of like every element of society, how every element of society is reflective or non-reflective of that. And monuments are just one part of it, one sliver. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Ashleigh, thank you. That was great. I love, because I know you work in a university, so you're accustomed to this, but for us to get a chance to kind of sit and have, feel like we're back in college for a few minutes.
I was trying not to make it too collegey.
No, but it's just.
I'm in professor mode this semester, though, so.
Right. So there's a question. You talked in the very beginning about the lost cause, and one of the pillars of that is that the war was not about slavery. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, what did they say the war was about?
Oh, many things. So they say it's like longstanding economic tensions between the North and South. They'll say cultural tensions between the North and South, and in that the North and South had very different cultures. Mm-hmm. And that, these cultures are, were going to be in tension this entire time. A lot of those same things, which often just comes back to slavery, to be completely honest. What was the big difference in the culture of the North and the South? Well, one was a slave society leading up to the Civil War, and one was not, right? Like, these are the big differences. So the economic things are it's true that the economies were very different, right? But that was also due to slavery. I mean, the North had industrialized in a particular way, and the South was still heavily dependent on agricultural labor, and that agricultural labor was supplied by a free labor force, which is slavery. So, yeah.
We have a comment here from someone who says that she was taught the lost cause version of the Civil War in Northern Illinois in the 1970s.
See, I mean, I think there's a way in which we don't even realize how widespread it is. I only do when I talk to people who are not from the South. I grew up in the South, born and raised, went to high school there, everything. And, I actually got versions of this history in high school where I actually had a teacher tell me the war was not about slavery, but I had learned a lot of history in my home to be like, that's not right. But this is how it was taught. And I think it probably wasn't until the 1990s where you started to see a change, but then that's still so much undoing that had to be done.
Mhm.
So, like I mentioned the polls, because you still do see in the polls when, they ask people what caused the Civil War. Now people are more likely to say slavery. 20 years ago, it was half and half, states'
Mhm.
rights or slavery.
Wow. So are there certain, I mean, there's probably still certain monuments and conversations going on that just are not going to, like, they're not going to come down. Like, I'm sure there's certain parts of the South where it's just not going to happen, even though it seems like a widely popular idea, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is most of them have not come down. The grand majority have not. Still, even though we're seeing many come down, there's
Mm.
actually a map. Hillary Green, who's a great professor at University of Alabama, she also does versions of Black Civil War memory too, and she's kept a map. And the noticeable thing with the map is there are a lot of plots, but we also know the number. I think it's somewhere like 500 or 600. I might be over underestimating of the number of Confederate monuments that remain.
Wow.
So most have not come down. Yes.
And I've read that these monuments, like, they're not really like artistic value, like they were just made in a factory somewhere. Like, they're not like.
Many of them are very cheaply done. Uh, that's like the interesting part of it to me is that and then when and you've seen a lot of recent years, I mean in like the last, 20, 30 years or so go up, and they're really badly done.
Mhm.
It's just like they wanted to put something up in these particular locations. So yeah, yeah.
There's someone here that has a question asking about Confederate statues on battlefields such as Gettysburg.
Oh, that's been very controversial, extremely controversial, because of what's on some of those statues. It's lost cause language. It's the righteous cause, and if we're saying that this is this is one of the biggest tourist spots in the United States is the field at Gettysburg. So, what do the national parks want people to get from that? From looking at a statue and hearing that the soldiers from South Carolina, fought for the righteous cause. And most of those monuments were put up, I think actually some of them were put up in the 70s and 80s, but a good chunk were put up in like the 19 teens, 1920s, 1930s. And it's a national military park. So it's like, what are we, is this a federal government park? What narrative about the war do we want to tell? And
Mhm.
part of the problem is that battlefield tourism has been very much embedded along with reenactor culture has been very much embedded in some ways with lost cause mythology. There's so many monuments at Gettysburg too. There are like a crazy amount of monuments, and I think like that that's a really good question, because I think that may be one of the most difficult things to dislodge, because the military monuments and the cemeteries are like one of the most stubborn elements of the lost cause, which is this idea that like everyone that fought deserves like the same amount of valor and commemoration.
Mhm.
And that sort of brother against brother idea about the Civil War is like one of the most stubborn and remaining like stickler parts of the lost cause. It's part of a lot of Civil War like film and literature. I didn't even get to that. Like that's a whole genre in itself. But that idea that they all deserve valor, it's been repeated many times over. So this is what you see sort of represented, right, in Gettysburg battlefield. I think though there's going to be a change eventually. I think in this moment in particular, where the government is trying to present these battlefields and national parks in a better light, you're
Mhm.
going to see these more discussions around, how to remove the monuments, contextualize them. We'll see.
Let's see, there's a comment in the Q&A, and the person writes, we were on a trip to Charleston, South Carolina last year, and the term enslaved people was used rather than slaves. The reason
Mm.
given was that the term slave removes people's dignity and personhood. Do you think this is true? We thought it seemed more of a way to make slavery seem not as terrible as it was.
I am a person that uses both, and I'm very careful to use both. I'm just going to say philosophically, the way I was taught as a historian is that like I cannot give another person humanity. So by saying enslaved, I'm doing it to sort of, you know, soften it a bit, just like on the person, the identity of the person. But I also realize I can't do that because they have humanity imbued in them. I'm not some giver back of humanity. Like, so, you know, I tell students all the time, like, I never say I humanize these people in my writing. They're already humans, right? So there's, you know, quite a few, I would say, historians and Black historians in particular use enslaved versus slaves. Some of them say slaves says slaves. Many slaves call themselves slaves. Many enslaved people call themselves slaves. I think you see more in like the public eye and popular culture, more people using that terminology. So I'm not surprised in Charleston that I heard that. I'm actually impressed. I don't know where you went on a tour that they were actually using that terminology, but I think that there is like a way of you know, talking about the, you know, enslaved population to make it seem that, you know, it's more dignity involved, right? Than you know, just to say slave. But as I said, just in my own work, I don't think I can give dignity to people. They already had it, so I can't do that as a historian. Look in the past.
We have a comment here that says it's mind-boggling that in this instance, the losing side has had a greater hand in writing the history, or maybe the louder voice in how to say it. So they lost, and yet somehow they.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it all happened with the complicity of the North. I mean, I think that's what you have to really realize is that it would have never spread that far was in the complicity of the North. And by the time that we reach sort of, you know, the 19 teens, we see this coalescing around the Southern narrative in the North. So we see Birth of the Nation come out. It premieres in LA. It like has a huge premiere in Boston, has a huge premiere in New York. And, you know, you have these people like, yes, this is the real story. And this is happening at the same time that the first wave of Black migrants are coming up north as well. So for white Northerners, they're looking to white Southerners to kind of confirm prejudices they may have had. Like, oh, they know Black people better than us. And when you see these tensions in the northern cities, including in Chicago, that happened right after the first wave of Great Migration, a lot of it's based in the same sort of, you know, racist ideas that, you know, we think are just Southern ideas. And, you know, Northerners have internalized it a lot. I mean, that's why I made the point of, you know, talking about how easily it made its way into textbooks, because people kind of wanted to believe it too. I mean, they wanted to believe these things about the war. So much of reconciliation, the North and the South reconciling with each other, was reconciling around this idea of like, we're all brothers, right? Like we all, you know, the battles of these days are over. And like African Americans being like, wait a second, is it over? Like, we're still not really completely free in the fullest sense yet. But by that point, you know, both white Northerners and white Southerners had moved on. So it happens very easily that the losing side wins if you have the winning side also complicit.
It's really interesting. Someone here wrote that we're still fighting the Civil War.
Yeah, I think in some ways we are, but I think in other ways, the South is such a weird place now that you would not have seen as many monument removals if the South hasn't already changed in a lot of ways. And it has. The South is very different. You see, you know, where I'm from in South Carolina, this would have never happened 20 years ago, but there's been a huge influx of people from the North that moved to Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, all these cities in the South. And they're changing the politics of, you know, particularly white politics in these cities. You know, they're becoming different. So you're seeing more interracial like protests around these issues than you would have seen 20 years ago. So I think it's becoming complicated, but I do think we're still fighting to fully realize the idea of Black emancipation, which was the promise of the Civil War. And in that way, I think we are still fighting for that, right? Like, I think that's why there's still protests in the streets, because we're still trying to find that element.
Someone here wrote a comment kind of referring to the later part of your presentation. She writes, I understand the importance of removing statues. Oh, hang on a second. The chat moved. Hang on. Removing statues of people who were involved with slavery, but I'm curious about where it stops. For example, Ulysses S. Grant, I believe.
Yeah, I didn't even get to get into Grant and that. I mean, it's interesting because I'm not, so on the one hand, I think some of those statues that came down were just kind of like, I see a statue, I'm going to take it down. And I don't know if there was much thought behind it. And the other way, though, I did see people articulate this idea that, Grant, owned slaves or maybe owned the slaves. But I saw a much, actually, I think, more complex argument, which is about Grant's relationship to Native Americans, which is like something we do not talk about as much, moving beyond the Black-white paradigm. That's why I mentioned Columbus statue coming down, because I think for indigenous groups of people in particular, Black people too, but indigenous groups in particular, the history of Columbus is like a fraught and violent history. And that's what Columbus represents, particularly to them. Grant's actions, as a president, as many of the presidents, including Lincoln, did towards Western expansion, was inherently violent. Someone brought this up in discussions about Lincoln over the summer. We rarely talk about how there was Western expansion still going on during the Civil War. And the largest mass lynching in US history happens during the Civil War. So, dozens of Dakota men are lynched because, they're fighting back US troops that are coming in and trying to take over their territory. This happens under Lincoln, right? And under Grant, we're seeing the really rapid and violent expansion out west that goes on for like another 15 or 20 years. I don't know if I have an answer for where it starts. Do I think we're going to be tearing down Grant statues? We'll have to probably wait another 100 years for that to happen. But I think that that sort of like iffy, like I said, moving beyond sort of the easy Confederate traders is where the really interesting conversations happen. Because I think it's forcing us to learn new things about some of these presidents and some of these figures that we may not have known. And it's forcing us to sort of rethink, like, why we're honoring these people in the first place. When that Grant statue, was attacked, many people are like, why Grant? He's been, he was one of the best presidents for Black people. And I was like, sure, but it wasn't just Black people in the country at the time. And, Black people may very much think that about Grant, but indigenous people may have a very different perspective on Grant. And I've tried to be very respectful of that personally. And I think it's an opportunity for conversation about how we understand historical legacies beyond the Black-white paradigm. Conquistadores statues coming down in New Mexico, for example, doesn't have anything to do with African Americans, not really, but has everything to do with indigenous people in that region in particular. So I think that we're moving beyond Confederate statues. I think it's a good thing. I think and I think it's proving how complicated our history is and exposing some of the dicier, complicated parts about some of the people we've chosen to revere. Like I said, I don't think there's going to be a spree of removing Lincoln statues or Grant statues anytime soon. They're considered too revered to do that. Do I think that there'll be conversations open up more about the legacy of those people? Yeah, and I think it's a good thing. And but I also, like I said, I don't think that the people who necessarily attack all these statues are like doing so with a completely deliberate mind frame, so to speak. Some of them are just angry, knocking things over, and that's it.
Yeah, I know that in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there's a statue of Lincoln, and there's some students that are really working towards the removal of that. Someone wrote, there's a question in the Q&A. Someone wrote, given his place in American history, what are your feelings about movements to remove George Washington monuments?
Whew, that's interesting. It's so funny because next week in I'm teaching history of Black women, we're actually reading Never Caught, which is the story of Ona Judge, who of course is one of George Washington's slaves that escaped, and they basically continued to seek her for the rest of her life, rest of his life. And also, which, I always tell my students, the interesting thing is that Washington and his wife, and it was really his wife owned most of the slaves because she was really wealthy, but he owned, because pretty much co-owning. They flaunted gradual emancipation rules and laws. So they knew the capital was in Philadelphia then. And in Philadelphia, there was gradual emancipation, meaning, slaves couldn't be there for a long time without being free. And so they would purposely move their slaves back and forth between Mount Vernon And Philadelphia, once 6 months was up, because you could not be there longer than 6 months with a slave, then you'd have to free them. So there was deliberate, like, attention paid to slaveholding in Washington's life. I don't know if the monuments should be removed or not. I do think Washington is not the, pie eating, wooden teeth president we were all taught to, love and revere and when we were young. I mean, I say this as I see my daughter in elementary school getting that kind of education, right, about Thanksgiving and Washington and all these, figures. I do think Washington and Jefferson are probably the two presidents. They're probably two of the most revered of our early presidents. Also, two of the most controversial. I mean, you're not going to do anything with John Adams. He was an abolitionist, and he didn't have slaves, and him and his wife were anti-slavery. Like, they're pretty non-controversial, right? They're actually pretty decent people, and which is to say, there were decent people back then. I make this point too, because some of the questions, I haven't gotten a question in here yet, but a question I often get is like this product of their time question. And I take that as a historian because things are done very differently now than they were in the 1700s, thank God. But also, there were good people in that time. There were people who were morally right in that time. There were people who knew slavery was wrong. There were people who refused to own slaves. There were people who were fighting to end slavery. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. Then the Quakers turned against slavery. He, freed all of his slaves and became like anti-slavery and an abolitionist. So he's someone who actually changed. Like I said, the Adamses, they were anti-slavery. Like, there were people there that were well off, that were revered people that did not believe these things. So, if we're going to say product of our time, then we can look back at people who were sort of morally right, and we can challenge that defense of Washington at least. And I do think over the next 5-10 years, we're going to see a bit more discussion about removing Jefferson and Washington, maybe not their monuments, but removing them from the really high revered status that they have and bringing them back to a bit more complicated status. Let's say that. Like a complicated, like, sitting or status within American history, which I think is fine. I think, lots of people in our history are complicated. So
that's a really interesting observation about the conversation about, is it a reflection of the times, and yet there are people that knew it was wrong then, so they should have known better as well.
Yeah, no, I say that there are people, mostly Black people, who were enslaved, but yes, also prominent white people who were abolitionists, who fought against these things in the beginning. That's why slavery was such a big debate when, the Constitution was being written, because there were people who did not agree with it. There were people who saw it as a necessary evil, right? And these conversations were happening, meaning that there were alternate viewpoints. So if we could view Washington and Jefferson and all their accomplishments alongside the people who also accomplished those similar type things, but also didn't do, weren't enslavers, all these other things as well, how would we then position Washington or talk about Washington and Jefferson when we're telling these sort of histories of the United States? So I think the Washington Monument's coming out now. No, we're never getting rid of the Washington Monument, or probably the Jefferson Memorial, but I think you'll see the conversation around them change a little bit.
Very interesting. Interesting to see where this heads us. So, well, anyhow, I just, we got lots of nice comments about what a thought-provoking, presentation this was. And Ashleigh, thank you so much for joining us. It's really fantastic to hear from you.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me. Thanks for the excellent questions. Made me think. No, thanks for having me. And I'm really, I'm really happy that, I was able to join you and that we could do the virtual thing now. That's the one upside of this pandemic, maybe?
Small one, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyhow, thanks everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you, online here again with the library programs, and have a good night, everybody.
All right. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
guys.